Hi, and welcome to the Brookdale Visiting Writers Series show. My name is Suzanne Parker. I'm part of the English faculty here at Brookdale, as well as the director of the Creative Writing Program. Today on our show, we have Patrick Donnelly, a wonderful poet and translator who has two books, collections of poems out, called The Charge, and his newest book, Nocturnes of the Brothel of Ruin. And I'm so glad to have you on the show.
Thank you.
On a number of times, I've heard your work compared to the wonderful Walt Whitman's.
Oh, dear.
And I'm wondering what you think of the comparison. Do you see it?
Well, Greg Orr made that comparison in the blurb to my first book, and I worried about it then, and I pretty much still worry about it.
I've seen other people make the comparison as well, too, though, in critiquing or reviewing the books. So there's got to be something there.
Well, the thing that is maybe right about it is, although Whitman probably wouldn't have called himself gay, in fact, he kind of denied that towards the end of his life when people tried to put that on him. Same-sex love is a subject in his poems and also in mine. And also, kind of full-throated singing, same-sex desire. So sure, I will cop to that.
I can see sort of the nervousness potentially of this is who I'm being compared to on a first book blurb.
It's ridiculous,
But not untrue. But not untrue at all. Not untrue at all. Well, you have two books, collections of poetry. And I wonder, there seems to be a certain continuity in the thematic concerns that they both explore. And I'm wondering if you could maybe speak to that. I hate to ask a poet to describe their work, because that seems an awful thing to do to them.
Sure.
But, if you could describe your work or some such thing.
Please do it. Yeah. I always want to say, well, no, you describe my work. But there is a continuity, I would say. It's no secret that I've been living with HIV now for close to 25 years. So impermanence and mortality is a major theme of my poems, and that has not changed. And also desire. Emily Dickinson said in a letter to someone about her nephew's death, she told the story that in his last moments, he had asked for the door to be opened so they could come in. And she asked rhetorically, we would give anything to know who did he want to be left in, but really, what is there but love and death, So I see my poems as in the line of, great lyric poetry going back 5,000 years, love and death, basically. So it sort of boils down to that. But
I had a graduate teacher who had a similar saying, which was, there are only two subjects, sex and death. And no matter what poem you put in front of her, she would find either sex and or death in all things.
Usually both. So,
The Charge, your first book, which is a wonderful book and a wonderful debut book.
Thank you.
It definitely addresses the AIDS crisis, although never explicitly.
It never uses the word.
But there's many poems that deal with illness or nursing people, through their own deaths, and also the speaker sort of struggling with an awareness of his own illness. But it's not a dark book. I mean, and it's called The Charge, which can be a life force, and the electricity between people. And I'm kind of wondering how many permutations The Charge has in that book, how you saw that as the thread throughout the book.
Well, as you know from titling your own book and your own poems, that titling is a fun thing you kind of get to do late in the process, and a lot of ideas come up, and in retrospect, most of them seem awful, and how could I have even considered that? But The Charge came pretty early. It is a phrase from one of the poems, and it had a specific meaning in that poem that was sort of a usage that was going around the gay community in the late 80s or early 90s to describe HIV. It was a euphemism for HIV. And so that's how it came into my consciousness, but absolutely it means all those other things that one has been given a charge to enact in the world, an electrical charge, that you've been hooked up to jumper cables and, so yeah, absolutely. Oh, and the military meaning of, you were either on the receiving end of a, charge of soldiers coming at you, or you're one of the soldiers coming at something else. So absolutely, all of those things.
There's also this sense of obligation. You've been tasked with something. And I kind of wonder in a way, because your poems are addressing, a political issue, what is often a political issue, and was especially in the 1980s, the start of the AIDS epidemic. I wonder what your relationship is as a writer to politics. In general, what is the relationship of politics and writing, and how does that realize itself, or does that realize itself in your work?
I have to say I don't do a lot of thinking about that while I'm writing. I really have an aversion to preachiness in poems, either on my own behalf or reading other people's preaching, unless it's really good preaching, And even on, causes that I consider to be really crucial or important, I don't necessarily want to read a preachy poem about that. So I guess the way I looked at it, it was that I was going to sing more than preach. But it's not that I was unaware that some people would receive these poems as being, sort of a broadside against, conservative values. They present same-sex love and desire as equal to all other desire, which is not an idea that everybody, unfortunately finds congenial. So it's not that I didn't realize that, but I put it out of my head while I'm working. It's just you want to try and get it on the page, precisely and in the way that seems true. And later I might think about, oh, well, maybe that there's a political component to that. But I did some activism in the 80s and 90s, but it was separate. I didn't see my poems as being, a political tract at all. I wanted them to be songs. So.
So I think I can probably guess the answer to this. So do you feel an obligation to this subject then, or a responsibility to the subject, to people when you're writing it all?
You mean the subject of HIV epidemic,
and a community where you saw people you cared for greatly passing away from it?
I definitely felt that more about the charge, about the first book, that I wanted to leave a record of a specific time, a dangerous time when some people were living and a lot of people were not. So absolutely, as the making of that book came to a close, I was thinking in those terms that here's a time capsule. If you wanted to know, what this time was like for a certain group of people. I think I feel more free now that not all of my poems have to keep their hand on that subject.
Why?
Well, for one thing, I didn't die. It's almost a decade later. I wouldn't say living with HIV is, means nothing or that it's easy, but it's no longer the death sentence that it was in the late 80s, early 90s. So for one thing, I found someone to love, which is very much the subject of my next book. And so that sort of moved into the place that illness and death and being in a community where that was so huge. You know, now they can combine. Those two things can combine. And I'm certain know this poem of Akhmatova's called Instead of a Preface. And she's waiting in line outside a prison with a lot of other people to see her son, to have a chance maybe to see her son. And one of the other women in line turns to her and says, "Can you describe this?" Yeah. And she says, "Yes, I can." And I see my role that way. You know, it's like she accepted the responsibility to tell the story of a small place, a small time, but to try to tell it as it really was. And I guess you could say I accept that responsibility too. But, you know, there's a million stories out there, and this is why we have so many other fine poets. So I want to hear from them, you know, the truth of where they are, which I could not imagine. You know, that's the wonderful thing about poetry and writing in general. So
in a way, you were witness to an experience, but it seems like told through the lens of your own personal experience, instead of speaking for the group.
Yeah, I was not outside of it. I was not watching it as an objective observer. I was absolutely implicated in it, and what happened to others could have happened to me. So that was the point of view.
Well, it is a beautiful book, an absolutely beautiful book. And we're going to have to take a break. But when we come back, we're going to talk about Nocturnes of the Brothel. Oh, I can't say that right. Sorry.
Brothel.
Nocturnes of the Brothel of Ruin.
You don't get to say the word brothel very often.
No. So please join us after the break.
Family and friends can provide the support you need to reduce your risk of cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and stroke. Eat right and get active. Hi, and welcome back to the Brothel Visiting Writer Series show. My name is Suzanne Parker. I direct the creative writing program here, and I'm talking with Patrick Donnelly today, author of 2 books, most recently Nocturnes of the Brothel of Ruin, which has a fantastic cover, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you.
What is that?
I am a haunter of, photograph sites, and I found that it's a bathhouse in Cyprus, and it was from National Geographic.
It's an incredible shot.
Yeah.
Absolutely incredible shot. And an incredible book as well, too. What I found really interesting about this book is that it continues some of the themes, mortality, impermanence, connections of your first book, but then it just explodes it There are more voices in this book. It's in 3 sections. There's a whole middle section of poems about the mother.
Yeah.
And then there are these translations from, am I going to get this right, 1,000-year-old?
Yes, about that.
Wow. Japanese poems. I mean, it's just formally, it's so ambitious. And I'm really interested about how all these different things came to be in one collection.
Yeah, it was an interesting process. So, you write poems and you don't know where you're going. And my mother died in 2005 during the time I was writing this book. And I thought, well, I'll probably write maybe 5 poems about her or about her death, and I will sort of sprinkle them around the book. Well, 20 poems later, she had crashed into the manuscript that I was thinking of, and if you had known her, this was totally characteristic of her. She demanded a large space. So the whole middle section of the book became about that. So I've been translating classical Japanese Buddhist poems with my spouse, Stephen Miller, since 2004. This was a sort of, side thing that I was doing with my own poetry writing. And I started to notice how these poems were focused on the same kinds of things as my own characters in this sequence. And so I had the idea of just bringing them in and mixing them, not in a discrete section.
The translations.
The Japanese poems.
Yeah.
So I had the idea to just mix them in. So it almost functions like a Greek chorus. There are these 1,000-year-old Japanese voices sort of chiming in on the same subjects as these contemporary people. And I probably would not do it again because I don't want to be known as the guy who always mixes Japanese poems in with his books. But I was really happy with how it came out.
Did you have this when you started writing? And when you started writing towards a book, did you originally have a section? I know you said, you thought you'd have 3 or 4 mother poems.
Right.
Did you know you had a mother section by the time you were starting to put this book together?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I mean, it had, sort of metastasized. I had so many poems, and even not all of them ended up in the book. But I don't know how you work when you start to think about ordering a sequence, but I actually sit down on the floor and start making circles and cycles and phases in front of. I have to see them. I have to move them around physically. I can't do it on a computer or in my head. So yeah, it was like, well, where are these going to go? It had to be in the middle. So.
And were the translations, the Japanese poems, always part of the manuscript?
They were not. No. That was kind of a late idea.
Can I do this?
Well, can I do it was absolutely a question, because I had read books of poems by American authors where they had translations, but they were always in a discrete section.
Yeah.
So the idea of now I will, in effect, make these my own poems by incorporating them into my own sequence. Definitely, I asked, could I do that? And actually, a book of Japanese gave me permission to do that. There is a really old anthology of Japanese poems called The Tales of Issei. And they don't know who put it together, but whoever it was took already existing poems, stripped off their head notes, in effect titles, gave them new titles, and arranged them in a completely new sequence to suggest the phases of an unhappy love affair. So, and I thought, well, if they can do this 800 years ago, and they thought of, poems as Lego blocks, movable parts, I can do it too. So,
I think the way you said it kind of, I like the Greek chorus idea because it's mirroring, they mirror the themes, they add a voice to the discussion.
Right.
Discussions that are going on in the book. I hadn't thought about that as a Greek chorus, but definitely.
Yeah. Well, for instance, my mother was cremated, and there are a lot of Japanese Buddhist poems that refer either explicitly or obliquely to cremation. So it was easy to make that little juxtaposition. So it's no longer just personal. It becomes, it opens it up. You know, it's like, I'm not the only person whose mother has died, you know, and I think that is helpful. You know, the lyric poem can get a little self-absorbed sometimes. So it opened it up to have these other voices, and sometimes they even argue, you know, with the speaker or correct the speaker. It's like, no, you kind of got it wrong, so here's the corrective, you know, so.
This sounds like it would have been fun to sort of put together once you gave yourself permission to go for it.
It was fun, and actually it came pretty quickly, you know, when I decided to do that. But.
Well, I'd like to talk as well about this idea that you and Stephen Miller worked together on some of the poems in this book. 'Cause I think sometimes artists are very, very possessive about their work. What was the experience of collaborating on the translations like?
Oh, it's a hell of a lot of fun. You know, I had heard about translation teams before I even met Stephen. Did I mention that Stephen is my spouse?
I think you did.
Okay.
I know that, so I think you did. Yeah.
So I knew that he had been working on this body of poems from, you know, about the year 1000. And I thought, well, let's try. Let's just try a few. And we found that not only could we do it, but we really enjoyed going back and forth. And, you know, there's a kind of a corrective, or there's sometimes there's a friction because I want to go too far in a certain direction, and he'll pull me back. And conversely, sometimes I push him, you know, in directions he wouldn't have thought of. But it's really something that neither one of us could do together. And for that reason, it's really fun.
Are you bringing different expertise to the process?
Well, for instance, I have no Japanese, so not to mention classical Japanese, which is his field. So he gives me what's called a trot, T-R-O-T, and that's, you know, all the words of the poem as well as syntactical markers that tell me where to go, and anything that I wouldn't know culturally about this time or this context, he tells me all of that. And then I try to do a draft. And if you were to look at the computer files that, you know, hold my work on this, the oldest draft is at the bottom, the newest one is at the top, and there's sort of sometimes 50 drafts, you know, just sort of composting underneath while I try to get to something that we both feel is a strong poem in English and also true to the original in some fashion. So
I wonder, because translation so often people skew one way or the other about, you know, this needs to be, you know, an exact sort of, as close as an exact duplication as we can do in another language. And then some people more skew towards, you know, let's capture the essence of this.
Right.
You know, I think Pablo Neruda, you can see all the different sort of variations of his poems. How did the two of you kind of, was that the schism that you kind of were arguing over, and I want to go here and he wanted to go there?
Well, one thing is, I'm glad I didn't read any like translation theory before we started this. We just dove in, and now I have read it and I recognize the issues that they're talking about, but we just tried to solve the problems as they arose the best way we knew how. I wanted to hear real people talking because I did hear them in the poems. So it was a question of what English is this going to come into, and I did not want it to be stilted or Victorian sounding or weird in other ways. So I wanted a kind of archetypal voice, you know, that wasn't connected to any particular era or vocabulary. So, you know, when I work with creative writing students, we work with the thesaurus a lot. I don't know if you do, but there are 50 words that ostensibly mean the same thing, but they don't mean the same thing at all. They all have a different color or heat or connotation. They throw off tremendously different connotations. So when you're translating, I mean, that all comes into play. There are 50 possible words that could get plugged into this space, and it's going to, really affect the tone of voice of the poem.
The voice is beautiful, as are the poems. And I love, again, this idea that they are sort of the Greek chorus in what is such a powerful book, as all your work is.
Oh, thank you.
I'm a huge fan.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, I wish I could talk to you more about this, but we do need to wrap up.
Wonderful.
So thank you for being on the show. And thank you, folks, for watching. If you'd like to know more about the creative writing program at Brookdale, please go to our website, www.brookdalecc.edu, and please watch us again next time.